South Africa has been presented with an opportunity to influence global policies and advocate for national and continental interests on the world stage. The country is set to lead the G20 under the theme Fostering Solidarity, Equality and Sustainable Development. To discuss what is at stake and how South Africa can leverage its position, I'm now joined by Professor Isaack Khambule, who is a professor of political economy at the University of Johannesburg. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thank you very much for your time. We're counting days now before South Africa, at least informally at first, gets to take over the presidency of the G20. Just how significant is this, of course, it being a first for Africa?
This is definitely one of the most significant moments for South Africa and as well for the African continent as a whole, because we know this is the first time that South Africa will have the G20 presidency. And we must also recall that South Africa is the only member state within the G20 that is representing Africa outside of the African Union, of which was recently added during the G20 that was held in India. So this is definitely a pivotal moment for Africa and as well for South Africa to demonstrate their interest and as well as try to lure the kinds of foreign direct investment they need to grow the economy.
Of course, I went back in 1999 when the G20 was formed, ostensibly by the G7 group of countries, your US, your UK, France, and others. It was on the back of a global economy that was under threat, given at the time what was going on in places like Mexico, Russia, and some parts of Asia, who were indebted but couldn't pay their debts. And then came this whole idea of having this G20 group of countries that were then going to make sure that the situation that had been experienced in those years never happens again, and that the future will be proofed, so to speak. Has the G20 delivered on that 25 years later, 25 years since it was put in place?
I would definitely say that in terms of managing global governance, it has done quite a great job, despite us having had the 2007 and 2008 global financial crisis that we witnessed and its reminiscent impact on the entire global economy. But then again, I mean, the mere fact that we saw the rise of the BRICS and its ambitions to challenge the global financial architecture also says that there are certain failures that are to be found within the G20. And we know, of course, again, that most of the G20 economies, even before the G20, we had the G7 again. And the idea when we moved to the G20 was that we needed more inclusive governance structures within the G20 so that emerging economies can be included so that they can also have a say. But we know at the end of the day that in as much as countries such as India, South Africa have been included in this, there's also an outcry that says much of the global financial policies are not representative of the needs of Africa and other developing countries. Hence why, again, we are seeing the emergence of the new development bank. We are seeing the BRICS again and again. I keep on saying there's a need to reform the global financial architecture. And again, we can also see that there are certain countries that have been the victors in terms of this current financial order, particularly the likes of China, as well as the US, and as well as India. So some of the questions that we then need to be asking ourselves are the likes of China, India, likely again to want to see any reforms within this kind of G20 forum that has been beneficial to their growth within the international space? And again, looking at the posture that they're also taking within BRICS. So those are some of the contradictions that we are seeing. But in a nutshell, I do believe that in as much as there are certain goods that has been done in terms of managing and as well as stabilizing the global economy, there's quite a lot that needs to be done for developing nations.
Why is this though? Because, I mean, as much as they are not formal members, the G20, your main lending institutions in the world, that is your IMF and World Bank, have been part of these conversations almost since the beginning. And I mean, 25 years later, since the formation of the G20, we're still talking about reforming these institutions. People are questioning how these institutions get to go about doing their business and the impact of their practices, especially on developing economies and the poor around the world.
No, definitely. That is one of the key debates that we've been having over the last 25 years or so. And up to now, I think the only answer is we can see that there's a particular stronghold from your EU and other Western countries that quite have a stronghold in the G20, and that is why we've been seeing lesser reforms. I mean, for example, we can talk about issues that are related to illicit financial flows. There hasn't been much that has been done because we know that those particular illicit financial flows going over 80 billion US dollars annually moving from Africa to European countries again mimic the very same dependency complex and as well as colonial structures that we used to have. So in this particular case, again, what we are seeing then is the rise of these again, emerging nations that are saying, wait, we need to try and change and reform. But as indicated, the issues now here are the countries that have been the biggest winners, such as your China, such as your India, going to allow for those particular changes? And how will then those particular changes impact their growth going forward? Because we know they're one of the fastest growing economies. I mean, that GDP growth is around 7 to 10% annually, of which is a feat that most nations cannot reach. So in this particular case, there's also needs to be some recollection and as well as reorganization within the G20 to show commitments to want to put the needs of the Africa. And I mean, again, we can look at the African Union Agenda 2063, looking at the Africa we want. And there is the kind of position that we need to be putting forward at South Africa when we host the G20 president next year, to say this is the kind of Africa we want. And these are the milestones that we have to go through in order to get there. And this is what we are putting at the table in order for Africa to take its stake and not only be a mere just a participant within the G20 for the sake of participating.
Okay, I mean, of course, I mean, beyond purely economic issues, if there's anything like that, financial crises, and of course, the reform of the international finance system, there's the issues you've just touched on, what to do in Africa, but also, I mean, issues of inclusion, issues of discrimination, but also issues of war and peace have pretty much been a big part, certainly in recent years, of the conversations at the G20 summit.
No, definitely. I mean, we look at issues of conflicts that are currently happening. We look at the whole Ukraine and Russia war. We look at what's currently happening with Israel and the Palestine, and we also look at what's happening in Congo. And the idea, again, if we look at the theme of South Africa's G20 president focusing on fostering solidarity, and that on its own suggests that there's a need for solidarity across the globe so that we can end the current wars that we are facing. But again, what seems to be interesting here is how then are we going to foster that particular solidarity if we know that there's a particular division between Western countries and developing nations in terms of the standpoints that they are taking in these particular two wars that I've mentioned and the historical wars that we've had over the last 20 years or so. So that also presents another picture that has many contradictions and that we want to see as to how all of these are going to be channeled within what is currently happening. I mean, if you look at the South African case at the International Criminal Court, what we're asking ourselves then is, we know that there are certain countries that are within the G20 that are opposed to what South Africa is doing. So how do they then foster solidarity? And at the end of this G20 presidency, what is there then that is likely to emerge as the solutions that we want to seek for a better world that we want to see. And again, issues of sustainable development, we know. I mean, countries such as South Africa have been lacking in terms of growth, in terms of their poverty rate, in terms of employment. And again, we also see the very same structure again, whereby we see African countries wanting to ponder to your Western countries so that they can get some sort of foreign direct investment, so that they can grow their economies and ensure job creation. And this again has also perpetuated that particular dependency complex. And we need to have honest discussions then as to how far are we willing to go as Africans in order to build our own sustainable development paths that are not necessarily aligned or not necessarily again linked to what the West wants.
Let's end it off, Prof, where you started that this remains. I mean, we're talking about 19 countries plus two, blocks, your AU and your European Union. In the context, of a world that has over 8 billion people and 193 countries, it still remains an exclusive club. Do you think they're going to tackle that issue this time around?
I don't think so. I mean, this time around, what we can definitely say is this is going to be more conflicting and as well as probably produce more debates than we thought. I mean, for example, I look at the issue of climate change and with the likes of Donald Trump coming in now and saying they need to do away with the new Green Deal. So what does that even mean for the entire G20 if the US is taking a particular stance and the entire Europe was going in a particular direction? And we are also seeing this again within the entire Europe that is busy saying it is time now for Europe to be able to take their own policies, and policies again that will not be dictated by the US. And that again on its own is showing you these fragmentations that are only going to make matters worse within the G20. And now we can only imagine as to what does it mean then for the inclusion of other developing countries that do not have a say in terms of how these policies are made. And again, it also shows the burden that countries such as South Africa and some of its BRICS peers have in terms of trying to bring about the core issues that are faced by these emerging and developing economies.
Prof, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. That summit, of course, takes place next week. President Cyril Ramaphosa will, at the weekend, together, of course, with business leaders, community leaders, and academics, and intellectuals and other thinkers will be making their way to Brazil this weekend.